This took place back in November of 2018 in North Carolina. I was 14 at the time, and my family had just moved across states. After a long road trip, we had finally arrived in the city where we planned to live. We were all hungry, so we decided to grab dinner before picking up the keys to our new house. We went to a local pizza shop. Since we had our dogs with us because we hadn't moved into our house yet, we decided to eat in the car. I'm a fast eater compared to the rest of my family, so I finished long before they did. After I was done, I decided to take my puppy out to do her business. We were standing just a little ways up from the car, playing in the leaves on the ground. I grew up in Florida, so I wasn't used to seeing piles of autumn leaves, and I was just living my best life, not paying attention to my surroundings. That's when a man tapped me on the shoulder. My dog noticed him and immediately tried to jump on him, as she does with everyone, so I pulled her back while stepping away from him. He looked to be in his mid-40s to 50s. He gave me a creepy, forced smile and said in a scruffy southern voice, "You have my dog, my border collie." Immediately, a red flag went off in my mind, as my dog obviously looked like a boxer, nothing like a border collie. I'm horrible at confrontation, so I nervously said, "I think you're mistaken, sir. This is my dog." I didn't even bother telling him that my dog looked nothing like what he was describing. I glanced over at my parents' car, which was just a few feet ahead of me, unsure of what to do. They hadn't noticed the man approach me. They were busy on their phones. The man then asked, "Would you be able to come help me look for my dog?" At that moment, my stomach dropped. I didn't want to make a scene, thinking I was probably overreacting, but I had read enough kidnapping and sex trafficking horror stories to have an idea of what could be happening. He then said something along the lines of, "I have some money in my truck for you," if I went with him. My hands started sweating. He pointed to a very sketchy, run-down-looking truck. I told him I was busy and had to go, but wished him luck finding his dog, still trying to keep him on my good side. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't tell him my parents were right there. If I had, I think he would have backed off. But I tend to overly worry about what others might think, so I was just trying to be polite and not make him mad. Then, he grabbed my dog's leash and said he had dog treats in his truck, starting to walk away with her. I pulled the leash away from him and said sternly, "I have to go now." As I began walking away, he grabbed my wrist, ripped the leash out of my hands and threw it to the ground. He started pulling me with him, mumbling something like, "Just come see what I have for you." My dog, being the sweet girl she is, followed after us and started barking as he dragged me. I'm pretty small, about 5'4" with no upper body strength, so I just started screaming for him to let go of me. My parents, alarmed by my screams and seeing our dog chasing after me, noticed the man pulling me against my will. They immediately started sprinting toward me. I screamed, "Mom! Dad!" I think he panicked when he heard me yell out, "Mom!" especially when he saw my parents running toward us. He realized my parents had been right there in their car the whole time. He made a run for it, and we didn't chase after him. My parents were just relieved to have me safe. This was definitely not a good way to start our new life in North Carolina, especially since we hadn't even lived there a full day yet. I don't wish this experience on anyone. It was terrifying. But my advice is, don't be afraid to use your words even if they offend someone. In moments like this, it's not the time to worry about what others think. My New Year's resolution for 2012 was to get in shape again. After my first child was born, I had lost interest in athletics, but I was determined to regain it. So, I started running 4 days a week with my friend Hannah, who is a great runner and motivator. We would run after work, covering 5 to 10 kilometers, usually favoring the forest trail. It's the kind of trail that has lighting during the darker months of the year, so you can run there at any time. Once you turn on the lights, you have 45 minutes to run the shorter trails, and more time for the longer ones. Then the lights shut off automatically. We had been running for about 2 months when we started noticing the same man hanging around the parking lot every time we arrived. He was a thin man, about 30 years old, always dressed in sports clothes but never actually running. He never looked anyone in the eye either. We speculated that he might be homeless, camping nearby because he was always there. We got used to seeing him, sitting quietly somewhere nearby, always on his own. We felt sorry for him. He never seemed to talk to anyone or interact at all. but there was something about him that made us hesitate to talk to him or ask if he was okay. I can't pinpoint what it was, but something just wasn't right. One evening, Hannah couldn't make it to our run, and I decided to go on my own. I arrived at the parking lot, my car being the only one there. I did some stretching, turned on the lights, and set off on the 5-kilometer trail. I hadn't seen the thin, silent man when I started my run. Perhaps it was getting too cold for him to sit there now that it was autumn, dark, and nearing freezing temperatures. He must have been there, though, somewhere in the shadows, because when I got to the top of the first steep hill, I could hear heavy breathing behind me. I looked over my shoulder and saw him. He was running like a man possessed. He wore regular shoes, not running shoes, and his arms moved in a strange, stiff manner, as if he were made of metal with his hands angled straight and upward, sort of like a sprinter, but more extreme, moving like a robot. For the first time, he looked me straight in the eyes, and they were the eyes of a predator. It made my heart freeze. He had never done anything to harm me or anyone else, as far as I knew, but the look in his eyes was enough to let me know that I was facing a serious, serious threat. I started running faster, trying to create distance between us. I could hear his heavy breathing becoming even more strained. I ran like my life depended on it, adrenaline surging through me, giving me new strength. I tore off my necklace and threw it on the ground, thinking, I need to leave a trace if he takes me. Something must be left behind. I tried screaming, hoping someone would hear me, but I couldn't scream my lungs out and keep up the pace at the same time. Why is he doing this? What does he want? Who is he? I thought, as my lungs started to burn. Then I thought of my 15-month-old daughter and kept running until I could taste blood in my mouth. He was still behind me, about 100 meters back now, but I figured that if I tripped and fell, ran out of energy, or fumbled with my car keys when I reached the parking lot, I'd be in trouble. So when I reached a sharp turn on the trail, I veered off the path and ran straight into the dark woods. I ran a short distance and then lay flat on my stomach, my hands searching for a rock to defend myself if he found me. I realized, to my horror, that I was wearing bright running clothes with reflective strips and neon colors. I had never felt so visible in the dark before. I heard him reach the turn and, thank God, continue running. I started to move slowly and as silently as possible further into the darkness. My heart sank again when I soon heard rapid footsteps coming back down the trail. He must have realized I had gone off the path when he saw no sign of me ahead. He stopped and I froze. I could imagine him listening for any sound, and I held my breath, praying to a God I didn't believe in to make him go away. After a while, I heard him say something in a language I didn't recognize and walk off. I didn't move. I was terrified he would wait for me by the car and realized I couldn't go back to the parking lot. I needed to get off the trail and onto the main road to stop someone. I started making my way further into the woods, knowing I would eventually end up near the end of the longer trail, close to the main road. The lights on the trail suddenly shut off. At first, that made me feel calmer, as the darkness offered comfort and protection. But then, after only a few moments, the lights turned back on. This could mean another person had started their run, and soon I might have someone to help me, or that he was still out there looking for me, or perhaps stalking another lonely runner. I decided not to wait to find out and continued toward the main road. It was dark, and I fell multiple times, my clothes becoming soaked from the damp vegetation. I was starting to feel cold. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the 10-kilometer trail ahead and knew I was close to the road. Soon I could hear traffic. When I finally reached the road, I must have looked like I'd been in an accident. Blood from several small cuts from the falls, my clothes dirty, and my face, I assume, petrified. My bright running shirt soon attracted the attention of a passing car, and my desperate waving and shouting made it stop. The driver, a man in his 40s with his 2 kids in the back seat, spent the next 10 minutes or so trying to make sense of what I was saying between my sobs and tears. He asked if I wanted a ride back to the parking lot, but I told him no. Please take me home instead. At home, my husband insisted on going to retrieve the car and calling the police. To report what? I asked. No crime has been committed. I just know he was out to get me. My husband went back for the car. The driver's side window was smashed and my phone was gone. So was the photo of my daughter that I had hanging from the mirror. I don't know what that man was trying to do or why he chased me the way he did. But the look in his eyes, there was no doubt he had bad intentions. My sister never had great taste in men, and during the autumn of 2012 she started dating a man named Marco. He was her age, 26, and worked as a chef. My sister and I are very much alike, but also each other's opposites. Identical twins with two very different personalities. She is trusting, fun-loving, social, and bubbly. I'm a total introvert, in love with my books. We are very close though, always have been, as I assume most twins are. It was when she first brought Marco to a family dinner at my parents' place that I noticed some less than charming cracks in his otherwise well-kept mask. It was subtle at first, but the signs of a controlling and jealous mind were there. A brief hint of contempt would dance across his face every time she paid attention to someone else or when it became clear that she was much more intelligent and well-read than he was. He was very good-looking though, I'll give him that. I guess that's the veil that kept my sister from seeing the truth. A wolf in sheep's clothing. He was fit, tall, with broad shoulders and green eyes. He had a charming smile and a confident posture. Soon she stopped calling me. She used to call me daily. Then the family dinners dwindled to almost nothing. She started wearing clothes she wouldn't normally pick for herself. I tried talking to her, but at first she wouldn't listen because when he wasn't being a controlling asshole, he was the love of her life. Yeah, I told her. Psychos are weird like that. One afternoon, she phoned me while I was standing in line at the grocery store, but what she said made me drop everything and rush to the car. She was calling from a cafe, and what she told me was chilling. They had had a verbal fight that escalated until he stormed out of their home, slamming the door behind him. Later, he returned with a new car. He had sold his old two-door vehicle and bought a larger one, an old Volvo V70. He stared at her and said, "This car's trunk is so big I could easily fit a body in there. Just so you know." At that point, she had gone into the bathroom, started to draw a bath, and climbed out the window. Where I live, this kind of threat isn't taken seriously by the police. If you haven't been hit and don't have the marks to prove it, you have nothing. So we decided that she would leave town and accept a job offer she had been interested in, but had turned down because he didn't want her to drive over an hour to work each day. She would stay with our friend Joe, who lived just under an hour from the new workplace, but 2 hours away from her current city. Joe was an old childhood friend who had never been introduced to Marco. It felt safe. I had phone contact with her every day to make sure things were okay. She seemed happy again, and I thought the danger had passed, until the day I was out running. I had finished my run and returned to the parking lot. I usually hide my car key on top of one of the tires, and as I reached down to grab it, he put his arm around my throat, tight enough to make it hard to breathe. "One twin is as good as the other," he whispered, starting to drag me away from the car. "Your sister caused this. It's her fucking fault. She will never see you again. That's her punishment," he mumbled in my ear as he pulled me toward his car. Not the Volvo, but still a car of the right size. I was panicking, and despite my struggling, kicking, and desperate squirming, he had no trouble keeping his hold on me. It was terrifying to realize how much stronger he was than I. I'm a fit woman. I run and fence, I have competed in CrossFit, and I did everything I could to fend him off, but it didn't help. That's when I used my one free arm to stab the car key into his inner thigh. I aimed for something more painful, but his grip on me made it impossible to move enough. It stunned him enough to loosen his hold, and I used the short window of opportunity to crush the tiny bones in his foot with my trail running shoes. He still managed to knock me down, but a group of cross-country runners interrupted him, and he fled the scene. My sister came home to testify against him, and once she started talking, she had a lot to say. Together, we and the guys from the cross-country team convinced the court to lock him up. Not for as long as I would have liked, but still. A few years back, when I was in the 10th grade, I stayed after school to get some extra work done. It must have been a Thursday, sometime in the late autumn months. We no longer lived in my hometown, having moved to a peaceful forested community. The activity bus, which ran late 2 days a week, would reach the gates of my community at around 5:45 p.m. It would drop you off at the gates and you'd have to walk the rest of the way home, or have someone pick you up. At that time, no one could pick me up because the only car we owned was with the only driver in the family, and he wasn't due home until sometime after 8 p.m. I had already decided the previous year, when I first started staying after school, that it would be quicker to walk home rather than wait for my dad to pick me up. This proved to be true, as it only took about 45 minutes, 30 if I didn't stop to watch the river, and 25 if I booked it with everything I had. Let me take a moment to describe the layout of the trip home. The walk took me up a gently sloping hill that leveled out somewhat as it met the creek, which twisted and turned its way below the road. Then, it climbed a steep hill that dipped slightly, only to rise again into another smaller hill that leveled off for quite a distance before turning and continuing up yet another hill. All of this sat on the large hill that is the community itself. Anyway, I found this walk home to be especially enjoyable, as I watched the autumn leaves dance in circles as they fell lightly around me. I took in the familiar smells that autumn brought to the community each year, and watched squirrels hop about, chattering as they gathered nuts and berries in preparation for the coming winter. I marveled at the sight of deer families foraging among the trees, and laughed at the antics of colorful birds darting to and fro, calling to one another as they searched for the last retreating insects. Once I reached the creek's crossing, I stopped, as usual, to watch the light dance on the water's surface, playing off the large, round stones scattered throughout the stream. A recent storm had knocked a fairly large tree onto the shoulder, leaving a decent dent in the railing. Normally, I would spend 15 minutes here, but that day, for whatever reason, I felt uneasy. I kept hearing something moving in the dead leaves that covered the ground. Something big. I initially wrote it off as a deer or a bear, as they were common in the community during this time of year. However, I just couldn't shake that uneasy feeling, so I continued up the hill without stopping. I should mention that I was essentially blind to anything that wasn't close enough for me to touch since my glasses had broken a while back, and I hadn't yet had the chance to get new ones. As I walked up the monster, the steep hill, I began to worry. I realized that the sound of rustling leaves hadn't stopped. In fact, it had gotten closer. Whatever was following me had caught up and was maintaining its distance. I knew this because when I stopped walking, it stopped too. When I resumed walking, it would wait a step before continuing. I moved to the center of the road, fearing that if someone was lurking on the side, they might try to grab me if I walked too close. I should take this time to share a few facts about the road and the community I live in. First, this road sees very little traffic at that time of day. Second, about a month earlier, my mom found a list of pedophiles and ex-convicts living in our community, many of whom lived disturbingly close to our home. Knowing this, you can understand why I was concerned. As I neared the top of the monster, I decided to stop and look around, hoping to confirm it was just a deer. But when I stopped, the footsteps continued without hesitation. At that moment, I realized whoever was following me must have been walking above me, on the left side of the road where the land rose atop a 15-foot ledge. Their plan, I realized, was to meet me at the top of the monster, where the ledge gradually sloped down to meet the road. Needless to say, I started running as fast as I could, thinking that if I reached the house about 30 feet away, I might be safe. But as I began to run, they began to run too, and they didn't stop. Not even when I stopped for a family I knew well, who pulled up alongside me in their car. The mom asked if I needed a ride, saying I looked exhausted. I gratefully accepted, climbing into the back seat with her 3 daughters, 2 of whom waited for the bus with me every day. I'm certain now that whatever had been following me was human. I think I'll avoid walking that hill alone from now on. One evening I was in Lacey, Washington to pick up a handgun I had recently purchased for protection. Contrary to the pickup status both online and in the email I received, the store didn't have it in stock yet and told me to come back in another week. I lived about an hour from Lacey at the time, and by the time I got there, evening rush hour was becoming unbearable. I didn't want to drive all the way home just yet, as it would have added an extra hour to my already long commute. Side note, the car I was driving belonged to my dad. I was borrowing it until I had saved enough money for a new car after my beloved Honda broke down the previous year. I killed some time browsing in the store where I had purchased the firearm, then decided to head over to the nearest coffee shop. It was a newly built cabin-style cafe with a modern twist. The barista handed me my chai, and I walked back to my car. I then drove to a gas station around the corner, still trying to kill time until the traffic thinned out. The car didn't need gas, so I pulled into a parking spot right at the corner of the 4-way street block where the gas station was located. I turned off the engine, stepped outside, and lit a cigarette, leaning against the driver's side door to avoid stinking up the interior. The weather was overcast and drizzly, but not overly cold. It was dusk by now, and most of the daylight had disappeared. The stoplights at the intersection were diffused by the late autumn mist. I watched them flicker from green to yellow to red as the traffic moved in a steady rhythm. Zoned out by the lights and lost in thought while enjoying my coffee and smoke, I didn't notice the man walking toward me until he was already halfway across the street. He was white, of average height, with strawberry blonde hair, and appeared to be in his mid-20s. He hadn't changed his clothes in a while and carried a backpack that I assumed held all of his belongings. Although he didn't smell, he looked ragged and unkempt. My immediate thought was that drugs were likely a part of his lifestyle. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I've always been cautious, having grown up in the suburbs of Seattle. The man finished crossing the street, awkwardly limping toward my car, maintaining eye contact with a forced grin. I locked my car out of caution but remained outside, casually smoking. Normally, I'm not a social person, but I don't go out of my way to be unpleasant either. He approached me, standing about 10 feet away, and said, "Hello," asking if I had a light. I complied hesitantly, but I saw no harm in meeting his simple request. He took 2 steps forward, and I lit his cigarette as he held it out toward me. He attempted to make small talk, weaving in hints that he had just gotten off the bus and needed to go down the road another block. Somewhere in his poorly crafted sob story, he stopped mid-sentence, like a bad actor pretending to have an epiphany. "Hey, would you mind just dropping me off down the road? It's not very far." I apologized and said I couldn't help, explaining that it was my dad's car and I didn't feel comfortable driving anyone without his permission, a plausible excuse I made up on the spot. Mr. Unkempt did not like my answer. His grin immediately turned tense and his expression flatlined. Clearly upset, he became more insistent, whining, "But it's just down the road. My leg is killing me, and it wouldn't be far for you. I'll give you a cigarette." His persistence and sudden burst of hostility made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I firmly said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't help you. It's my dad's car, and he has rules." Again, total BS. With 10 years of hospitality experience under my belt, I immediately offered him alternate ideas, like maybe asking someone inside the gas station for help or calling a ride. Every word I said seemed to irritate him more. He began curling his fingers into fists, not in a threatening way, but like a toddler about to throw a tantrum. He paused and sized me up. I'm small and not intimidating physically, so I quickly said, "I hope you make it home safe," unlocked my car, and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. When I looked up, I saw him speed walking back across the street in the direction he had originally come from. No limp, no awkward walk, no sign of pain or distress. Just a normal, rage-fueled walk. At that moment, I realized I had dodged a bullet. I felt pretty dumb for hanging around the city alone after dark. I didn't care about the traffic anymore. I turned over the engine and hightailed it home, even though the drive ended up taking an hour and 45 minutes. But this time, the traffic was 100% worth the inconvenience.